It's a great honor to be here with all of you, and especially to be here with Greg. Greg's work has been so important in redefining and broadening the frame, or shifting it entirely, how we see this country, how we see Latin America. And I'm really excited to be talking with you today, Greg. I wanted to begin, before we talk about the thesis of América, to talk about some of the latest events that have transpired, namely the new Pope, in relation to the old Pope as well. But first, if you could talk about the significance of a Latin American leader who has just died, José Mujica.
Jose Mujica, otherwise known as Pepe, was former president of Uruguay, and he became kind of famous as a very humble president. He drove a VW Bug, and he sold flowers, and Noam Chomsky visited him, and he drove around in the Bug, and there's a lot of photos going around. He just died. He just passed away. I believe it was. I didn't know I was going to ask this question, so I didn't. Was he 93?
89?
No, he was in the 90s. I think he was in his 90s. What's that?
89.
89, okay. And he really was a remarkable leader. You know, you get one of these people get elevated as a symbol of humility and peace, but of course he was a member of the Tupamaros, an urban insurgent group in Uruguay, where he lived quite a remarkable life. He was captured, he escaped, captured, escaped, captured, escaped. For 14 years he was tortured. He was tortured by the torturers who were trained by the United States, by Daniel Mitrione, and for those of you who know that story, and Tupamaros, of course, executed Mitrione.
And explain who Dan Mitrione was.
Dan Mitrione was a security advisor for the United States. I think, let's see, he probably worked under the auspices of USAID, if I'm not mistaken. And he trained first Brazilians and then Uruguayans in the technique of torture. He was famous for creating something called a dragon chair. Basically, you can imagine what it is. It was basically electrocution, torture by electrocution, and other techniques that would become famous, stress techniques that would become more well known during the War on Terror, which when we were told they weren't torture. They were just stress techniques, pressure techniques, whatever they were. And Mitrione was also infamous for taking homeless people off the street and using them as subjects to torture in lecture halls in Brazil and in Uruguay. And so anyway, this gets a little bit away from Mujica. Mujica was part of the Tupamaros, and they were an armed insurgency that actually formed before the coup, during the so-called democracy that wasn't much of a democracy. And he was arrested before the military coup. And he was tortured for 14 years. And then when he was released in Uruguay and Latin America returned to democracy, he became critical in creating the Frente Amplio, which was one of the most successful left alliances in Latin America, in the world. They've governed Uruguay mostly for the last couple of decades, except for the previous president, the one currently. And they're remarkable. So, I posted something on social media that, we didn't love Mujica because he sold flowers and drove a VW Bug. We loved Mujica because he killed fascists when he was a diplomat. And because he understood, that behind that smile there was a lot of steel, and he understood that, that the point was to get power and to use power. And Frente Amplio is really one of the most inspirational expressions of militant democratic socialism that we have, and it was largely. I don't want to give him all the credit. He was a key leader in that coalition.
And around the same time, a few weeks before, Pope Francis died. And a few weeks later, Pope Leo XIV has been anointed, has been chosen. Both men, significantly, one from Argentina and the current one from the United States, but lived in Peru for some 20 years. He was known as Father Bob until he became Pope Leo XIV. But talk about this transition, what Pope Francis meant, and this goes to some of what you talk about in América, because it goes to liberation theology, and also what you think Pope Leo XIV, why he even took that name, might come to represent.
Yeah. I mean, we're in a moment where, we're in such a desperate moment that we're paying close attention to schisms and political factions within the Catholic Church. Sidney Hook famously called the Catholic Church the most totalitarian organization that ever existed in world history. There's a lot of darkness related to the Catholic Church, and I talk about it in the book, but also there is this other impulse and current, which is the point of the book, the pulling it out, what leads to liberation theology. Pope Francis he came to represent that schism, whether he wanted to or not. He really was an individual that lived Latin America's 20th century in its fullest. He was born in Paranus, well, he was born before Peron, but he grew up in Paranus, Argentina, when the working class and the poor were making their entrance into the public square, to the public space, demanding social citizenship, and the state was responding. So he grew up in that circumstance. He became a Jesuit, and very quickly, as events spiraled out of control in Argentina towards the dictatorship in 1976, he was not a radical, he was not a liberation theologian, but he was a Latin American, and he was a citizen of Argentina, under Peron. So you could only, you could be quite fascist, but you can also, but most people are, tend to kind of straddle some kind of middle ground. There's evidence that it's a little dicey what he did or didn't do to protect Jesuits, particularly two Jesuits, one who accused him of turning them over to the military. He denied it. The Jesuits who accused him ultimately forgave him and said that they misspoke and that it was. But there's some people who read his subsequent career as an attempt to atone for his actions during the military regime in Argentina. And obviously when he became Pope, he brought with him all of this history of Latin America. And he was much more open, much more social. He represented and conveyed a critique of unbridled capitalism. He conveyed a strong critique of what we call neoliberalism as being anathema to the holism of what it means to be human. And his remarks kind of were part of this broadening schism between traditionalists and progressives within the Catholic Church. I'm not an expert in the Vatican. There's circles within circles, that makes the name of the rose look like Harry Potter or something. It's not anything that I'm an expert in, but I think Francis steered his way as best he could through the intricacies of the Vatican, and he put forward a very humanist, universal, to the degree that he could, with all of his faults in all of the ways that we all know. And I think that his death was met with quite a lot of joy by people like, J.D. Vance, the Pope he either killed the Pope or the Pope, gave up and died after meeting Vance. I don't know, one or the other. But the new Pope represents a continuation in many ways. There's strong evidence that Pope Francis and Pope Bob Leo were collaborators, and he of course there is, and this speaks to the book, as other people point out. He's not the first American Pope. Pope Leo Francis was the first American Pope. He's the first Pope from the U.S., but even that doesn't really describe the fullness of his experience. He spent a significant time in Peru, including in northern Peru in the 1980s during the worst of that country's insurgency and counterinsurgency, Fujimoris and Luminoso land reform. He spent 2 years. I think it had a deep impact on him. The stories coming out about how his grandfather was born. I mean, it's so wonderfully vague. It is inherently anti-MAGA because, you know, the idea MAGA represents some kind of purity. The idea that you can't quite pin where his grandfather was either born in Louisiana, the Dominican Republic, or Haiti, depending on my record. His maternal grandfather. And, you know, who knows what's going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen, but I think the investment that people have in the leadership of the Catholic Church speaks to the larger vacuum of political organization and political vision that defines the moment that we live in, and that's why we're so fascinated about it. And I will say, as soon as I heard in the radio, I was on the car radio, as soon as I heard that he chose Leo the 14th, I knew immediately that the reference was Leo the 13th, and that the reference was the Rerum Novarum, an encyclical that Pope Leo was known as the workers' pope, labor pope. He was also known as the slaves pope because he wrote a strong letter condemning Brazilian slavery. Rerum Novarum is a kind of, you know, at the time it was a kind of rearguard action against socialism, rising socialism, but it was also a strong critique of capitalism. It was an attempt to socialize capitalism. And I think that if you want to get a sense of what he imagines his role is, it's that in this moment of applied maybe to AI and our crypto overlords.
And standing up for immigrants and laborers.
Yes.
I mean, amazingly, in the last months, he had tweeted, at least it's believed, 4 times, either criticizing Trump or J.D. Vance for their lack of compassion around immigrants.
Yeah, that, you know, and obviously that's a social issue that splits the Catholic Church unambiguously, right? Abortion and gay rights and women's rights and sexual abuse scandals, right? Those all break down on patriarchy and people's, you know, and it's on our wedge issues. But even conservative Catholics have some kind of concern for the treatment of immigrants, at least some of them.
And one of the last public statements Pope Francis made was once again calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and having one of his 2 Pope mobiles used as a mobile clinic for the children of Gaza. And in the first Sunday sermon that Pope Leo gave, he continued that call for a ceasefire. It's very notable when he came out very strong with the Gaza, Ukraine, migration, and his critique of AI as a kind of anti-humanist threat to humanity. So there was one other thing now when you were talking that I had thought of, but now it slipped my mind. Anyway, maybe I'll come back to it. Which brings us to América. First, you know, you just said he wasn't the first American Pope. Of course, Francis was also American. And what América means, and how you are reframing not only the history of the United States, but all of Latin America with these countries vis-a-vis each other, instead of always, when talking about the United States, looking toward Europe.
Yeah. You know, my editor says at these events I need to be less abstract and talk more about the stories in the book. But there's a lot of stories in the book, and they're all good. A lot of interesting people. You can just take my word for it.
No, we're going to dig into that because I agree with your editor. But
I'll give you the bigger picture. So the book starts with the Spanish conquest, and it ends I can't quite say it ends with Gaza because I was writing it as Gaza was unfolding, and I can't say it ends with Trump because I was writing it before the Trump election. But it gestures, it moves towards that moment. So in some ways you can say the book is from the conquest to Gaza, and there is a kind of through line. You know, the argument is that the conquest of the New World, you know, the Spanish conquest of the New World in the early 1500s was of an order of a different kind of brutality than Europeans had ever seen before. Not so much because the nature of the bloodshed, but because of the fact that these were people that had to be explained, right? There was no denying. Spain, unlike England, couldn't deny that they were conquering a people. Bartolomé de las Casas, an early critic, a Dominican critic, thought there was more people in the Americas than there were in Europe. And Catholicism is a religion that presumes to be universal. It presumes to be the bearer of universal history. It presumes to be the bearer of universal wisdom. And it had to justify what it was doing. It couldn't just go in and start slaughtering people. Of course, that's what they did. But in order to there was also an enormous ideological or moral edifice that had to be grappled with, and that was Catholic humanism, and where the people of the New World fit into the history of the world and the history of humanity. And you know, I can go into the details later, or you can read about it, but basically there emerges a very strong critique by a number of Dominican and Franciscan and later Jesuit theologians and jurists that question pretty much everything about the Spanish conquest, including the legitimacy of the conquest itself. They put forward a strong case for the abolition of slavery in all of its forms. De las Casas was famous for declaring that all humanity is one. The actual Spanish, the English translation of the actual Spanish is all human lineage is one, meaning all human beings come from a single community. Right, they're not another species. They're not, there's not a, they're not a subhuman. They're not a different race of animals or whatever. They're all humanity is one. There was also a strong argument for the narrowing of what constituted a just war to very narrow criteria. Now, these critiques didn't necessarily stop the conquest, but they were consequential in the long run. The conquest went on, de las Casas died, and Spain created this enormous empire in all of the New World, a century before the Puritans set down in Plymouth, and it was magnificent in many ways. But at the center of it were Native Americans and then African Americans. They were the extractors of the New World's wealth, so they were the center of that. There was no denying them. But they were also the center of this kind of moral debate about the nature of Catholicism and the nature of humanity that went on and on and on. So the point is, there was no evasion. The tension that is laid out is with what happens, 100 years later when the Mayflower and other ships, the following ships show up, and northern New England is already decimated by plagues brought by Europeans before the Mayflower shows up, and Puritans get off the ship. Look, where is everybody? Look at this. It's empty. Literally, it's houses that are empty, and they develop a case for dominion based on empty land, that there was no people there. And this tension between a colonial empire that grapples and wrestles, no matter how hypocritical, with the reality of people and difference, compared with an empire that pushed difference out towards the frontier and denied it, right? And Native Americans weren't central to the colonial extraction. I mean, there was the fur trade and all of that, but not really the way silver and mercury and gold and copper was in Spanish America. So I trace those two tensions out, that kind of grappling with, and then the argument goes on to the wars of independence, and what happens is that the United States breaks away from England and revitalizes the doctrine of conquest. It reinforces the doctrine of conquest. The doctrine of conquest in the United States was taught by law professors into the 1920s as a legitimate principle of international law in the United States. And this had to do with moving west and taking Creek land, Cherokee land, Mexican land, and driving to the Pacific. Latin America comes into being a continent of multiple 7 republics, and they had to learn how to deal with each other. And one of the first things they do is they start to undermine the doctrine of conquest, and they invalidate the doctrine of conquest. And they spend the next century trying to get the United States to accept their vision of international law. And they do. You know, I mean, the story, I go through Wilson, I go through FDR, I go through the role of Latin America in the great anti-fascist struggle of the 1930s and 1940s, and the expectations of what the defeat of fascism in Europe meant for Latin America. But mostly important, I talk about how Latin America, basically all of the principles that are put into place in 1945 with the United Nations that are called the rules-based order or the liberal international order, a rejection of conquest, a rejection of war of aggression, and the premise that international relations should be organized around cooperation rather than competition, and eventually a rejection of colonialism. All of that was present at Latin America's creation, even if only in fledgling form, in embryonic form, but then develops and gets stronger as it's contesting the United States. So that's the argument. Now, of course, we'll jump forward 50 years, and the doctrine of conquest is back, and just to bring it back to relevance, and what we see its burlesque form in Trump when he says he's going to take Greenland by force or turn Canada into a state, and he says he's going to use coercion. It seems, we're not really sure what to make of that. I think what he's doing is he's signaling a shift in the foundational premise of the international order, that nations are no longer organized around the premise of cooperation and shared interests, but they're organized around the premise of competition. And of course, we see its more fearsome expression in Gaza, where the doctrine of conquest is completely revitalized. The word conquest is used, with abandon and without care, without any shame. So in some ways, that's why the book could have been called From Cortez to Netanyahu, or something like that.
Interestingly, Trump is on his Gulf tour, his first major international trip, and there has been some suggestion that he wants to change the name, the Persian Gulf, to the Gulf of Arabia.
That's a long-standing thing.
The reason, people actually believe it is because what he's done with the Gulf of America. And my favorite review of yours in the Los Angeles Times, the headline was "The Gulf of América." I think that's a pretty good compromise.
Yeah, it's a compromise.
But I want to sort of push your editor's line in telling us stories. Go from Simón Bolívar and really specifically talk about the effect Latin America had on FDR and the New Deal, and tell us about a radical journalist who we didn't get to talk about on Democracy Now!, though I promoted it, and that was Ernest Gruning, and what he has to do with all of this.
So I'll talk about that. I'll come back to Bolivar. There's a big gap between Bolivar and Gruning. So, a big part of the book is, this tension, right? That to understand American exceptionalism in its fullest form, I'm being abstract again, you need to understand not just the United States, but all of the Americas, how there was this competition between Latin America and the United States over things like the doctrine of conquest. And for years, Latin America and the United States would meet in these Pan-American conferences, and Latin America would complain about, the latest outrage that the United States did, and would demand that the United States give up the right of intervention and recognize the absolute sovereignty of individual nation. And for years, Latin American diplomats would ignore them and say, no, okay, whatever. Then the Depression hits, 1929. Roosevelt's elected in 32. He's inaugurated in 33, March 33. He has a series of failed international conferences in Europe that doesn't achieve any kind of sense that there was hope for stability. But there is this other conference on the horizon, and that's in Montevideo, where Pepe Mujica was, would he have been born in 1933 if he was, no. When would he have been born if he was 89? 35, okay. Okay, so 1933 was the conference. Mojica would have been born within 2 years. So there's this Pan-American conference scheduled. And Roosevelt wants Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, to go down and deal with the Latin Americans. And Roosevelt, when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he was a pretty big imperialist. He claimed to have written Haiti's constitution. He tried to buy a bunch of land in Haiti. In that constitution, it forced Haiti to allow foreigners to buy land. I mean, Roosevelt had a reputation of being a little bit of a brash Harvard imperialist up until he became, I guess, a politician and a reformer. But he sends Cordell Hull and he says, look, give them whatever they want, give them lights so they can land planes at night, but don't make any changes to international law and don't agree for us to give up the right of intervention.